Pivot backstabs have been a useful and viable strategy to employ against your opponents in Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2. With the universal speed increase in Dark Souls 3, pivot backstabs have become quite tricky to land and thus have been discarded by many of the higher tier and even lower tier players. I completely disagree with this community-wide sentimentality, as backstab pressure is the only way to make a good player panic roll and counters a lot of the cancerous gameplay styles such as washing pole, running R1 spam, and R1 spam in general. To reliably pull off pivot backstabs, you need to identify two things in a match: latency and their counter pivot ability. Once the aforementioned points have been determined, you'll know if pivot backstabs are a viable strategy against your opponent. Pivot should only be executed with a high stability shield, Black Knight shield and Lothric Knight shield, to minimize the stamina damage done to you. Frankly, performing this technique with a low stability shield is still preferable to performing it without blocking as well, especially if you lack pivot backstab experience. The timing and pivot direction varies significantly with the specific weapon your opponent wields and the weapon class itself. Also, for the visual examples, I chose to primarily pivot the most used or the strongest weapons in its respective class. All thrusting R1s and R2s of the rapier class, in this instance S-stock, are very hard to pivot, and thus I do not recommend attempting this in a serious fight unless you have a significant life lead. Though, if the rapier they use is short, you'll have greater success pivoting it. The sweeping R2s and running R1s of this class, however, can be easily pivoted and backstabbed before the opponent can roll away. Admittedly, the sweeping R2s are not often used in neutral or aggressive play, assuming optimal play, but as a wake-up, they are much more frequently used, so this is the best time to attempt this pivot. Pivoting the R1s and R2s of the S-stock is executed by pivoting their left. The running attack doesn't need much of an explanation, just run to your opponent's left and backstab them during recovery frames. This is the best class to practice pivots against, as it requires the least amount of skill due to the forgiving nature of the pivot window. This is all assuming the opponent is using the spear in its two-hand stance, as it has better tracking, thus it's harder to pivot. You need to predict your opponent's R1 and run to his left, as the spear class tracks poorly in this direction for the BS. The R2s of the spear class have more tracking, so pivoting those attacks requires your opponent to have made a serious misplay. The run attack is simple to pivot as well, hug their left and BS during the recovery frames. I'll start with glaives, as their R1s and run attacks are child's play to pivot, so much so that a hard direction isn't even required. Simply choose left or right depending on your avatar's positioning, pivot and backstab. The R2s, or at least the first one, can't be easily pivoted due to the increased nature of the tracking. I'd like to give a special mention to the champion's charge weapon art. It requires good reaction time of the player to successfully pivot backstab. As you see the attack initiate, immediately run to your opponent's left and run past them. Turn around quickly whilst blocking to avoid pivoting, and run directly behind your opponent until the charge's overhead sweep is complete and BS during recovery. It's important to note that a preemptive backstab before the animation has ended will lead you to taking damage and then getting off scot-free. For halberds, pivoting them is rather tricky due to the tight pivot timing required of the player. To successfully pivot the one-handed R1s, since two-hand is the same but with less tracking, you need to be hugging their model and in the process of a pivot before they have pressed R1. The R2s require you to sprint through the model, i.e. good spacing, to successfully backstab. Pivoting the two-handed R1s of an overhead greatsword is as easy as a glaive. Choose which side you want to pivot. I have the most success with their left, and backstab. For the run attack, you need to pivot left, but also flick at the end to avoid the backswing, which makes this pivot more intermediate. Backstab during recovery. For Hollow Slayer, etc., pivoting neutral R1s is more finicky. To pivot backstab the first R1, run to their right and backstab. To pivot the follow-up, you need to have perfect timing, thus I'd consider this a hard pivot. Run to their left, unlock, get behind them, turn around and instantly backstab. Due to the sweeping nature of most ultra greatswords, pivot timing is surprisingly tight. You need to sprint towards the attack and be approaching their back by roughly half swing. The charged R2s have too much tracking to reliably pivot, so I recommend against it. For all rolling attacks, sprint towards their left and BS during recovery, same for the running attacks. Vertically swinging ultra great swords are a piece of cake to pivot, run towards their left, and backstab during recovery. I'd like to note that pivoting ultra great swords isn't necessarily the most optimal strategy to employ against them. Simply outspacing and punishing their whiffs is much more safe. Regular R1s of this class, sharing similarities with the Dagger class, are very hard to pivot, and I advise against attempting it. However, this doesn't mean pivot backstabs are a cross-out strategy. There is a rule I use when pivoting the running attack called the 3 o'clock rule, named courtesy of Missy Maru. Its execution is as simple as it sounds: simply run at the 3 o'clock direction of a clock and backstab during recovery. This particular pivot is surprisingly easy to pull off and impacts high-level play greatly. So, this is the most interesting class to pivot, as it's not reliably doable under normal circumstances, with the exception of the run attack, which requires you to pivot their left and BS during recovery. For the regular R1s, you need a head start, which you're never going to get in an actual fight. During the footage collection, my friend showed me a way to force yourself to be in front. You would need to stagger them with a weapon that has decent stun on the initial R1, immediately begin the pivot process, and backstab. This isn't a true pivot backstab, as the opponent can avoid it simply by not mashing R1 and rolling. You can't pivot Great Axe R1s or R2s reliably. For the running attack and rolling attack, pivot their left and BS during recovery, though same with ultra great swords, this isn't the most optimal strategy to employ against them. It's much safer and consistent to punish their R1s and R2s with run attacks of your weapon, assuming it's of a faster speed. Pivot the neutral R1s by sprinting to their left and BS during recovery. Put succinctly, you cannot pivot daggers excluding the running attack, in which case you would need to be pivoting them before they start the animation and backstab during recovery. To successfully pivot backstab katana R1s, you need to pivot their right side and backstab during recovery. For the running attack, you need to be in close proximity to pivot backstab the attack. Due to the nature of how the hit detection works plus latency, it is too fast to pivot at max range. To counter a pivot backstab attempt, you need to employ one of 3 techniques to find success: kicking, counter-strafing, and unlocked play. Since the most safe, thus common strategy to use whilst pivoting is to guard, kicking will shut it down and deal large stamina damage in the process, putting you in a more favourable position for a fleeting moment. This can be done on reaction. For counter-strafing, you need to read your opponent is going for a pivot backstab and start running, whilst locked on, in the same direction as they are. If done correctly, you will be at the opponent's back and can either go for the BS or wait for them to roll and punish them. The final technique, unlocked play, might evoke nostalgia from some of the older players due to its use in Dark Souls 1 and 2, but has had generally little use in DS3 PvP. For this, you need to react to the side your opponent is pivoting, unlock, and R1. Depending on your weapon, you will either hit their shield and stop their pivot attempt, or you'll hit behind their shield, for instance with a glaive, for a free combo. Pivot backstabs are an effective and low-risk method of pressure that often nets free damage. They completely shut down many weapon classes and are very effective against the big 3 meta weapons: Estot, Washing Pole, and Follower's Saber. To reiterate the core philosophy behind this, backstab pressure is the only way to force a good player to panic roll, and thus should be more frequently used in duels. Dark Souls 3 PvP lacks mechanical depth, but for what it lacks in depth, it makes up for in mind games. I feel backstab pressure will give a lot of good players that dismissed backstabs something to refine and add a lot of nuanced play to the top tier PvP scene. I'm Volhiren, thanks for hearing me out.